The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 7B in the downtown courthouse. Charles Bennett adjusted his navy blue tie and straightened the papers in his leather briefcase. At 42, he had handled hundreds of cases, but something about today felt different. Perhaps it was the whispers he'd heard about Judge Gregory Howard's reputation. The bailiff's voice rang out across the wood-paneled room. "All rise. The Superior Court of the State is now in session, the Honorable Judge Gregory Howard presiding." Judge Howard, a man in his early 60s with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, walked to his bench. His face wore the permanent frown of someone who had eaten something sour. As everyone sat down, his eyes swept across the courtroom, pausing briefly on Bennett with an unmistakable look of distaste. "First case on the docket," the clerk announced. "Peterson versus Miller Construction Company." Bennett rose smoothly, his posture perfect. "Charles Bennett, representing the plaintiff, Your Honor." Judge Howard peered down at him over his glasses. "You're new to my courtroom, aren't you, Mr. Bennett?" "No, Your Honor. I practiced law in this district for 15 years, though this is my first time before your bench." The judge's lip curled slightly. 15 years? Really? And where did you say you got your law degree from?" "Harvard Law School, Your Honor. Class of 2009. A few whispers rippled through the courtroom. Judge Howard's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "Harvard? Well, isn't that interesting? Let's see if your education matches your performance today." Bennett maintained his professional demeanor, though he noticed several attorneys exchanging uncomfortable glances. He began presenting his client's case, a construction accident that had left Sam Peterson unable to work for 6 months. "Your Honor, the evidence clearly shows that Miller Construction failed to maintain proper safety protocols." "Speak up, Mr. Bennett," Judge Howard interrupted. "I can't understand your mumbling. Do they not teach proper diction at Harvard?" Bennett raised his voice slightly, continuing with dignity. "As I was saying, the company's own safety logs show multiple violations in the months leading up to the accident. And where are these alleged logs?" Judge Howard demanded, his tone dripping with skepticism. "They're right here, Your Honor." Bennett held up a thick folder, marked as Exhibit A in the evidence package submitted last week. "Oh yes, your evidence package." The judge made air quotes with his fingers, drawing a few nervous laughs from the gallery. "Tell me, Mr. Bennett, do you always waste the court's time with such lengthy submissions?" The opposing counsel, Peter Wright, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Even he seemed embarrassed by the judge's behavior. Bennett remained composed. "Your Honor, the submission follows standard court procedures and contains all relevant documentation as required by state law." "Don't lecture me about state law, Mr. Bennett." Judge Howard's voice grew sharp. "I've been on this bench longer than you've been able to tie your own shoelaces." A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Bennett could feel eyes on him, some sympathetic, others curious to see how he would handle the situation. He took a slow breath before speaking. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. Peterson, has suffered significant injuries due to documented negligence. We have medical reports, witness statements, and the company's own records supporting our case." Judge Howard waved his hand dismissively. Yes, another worker claiming injuries. "Tell me, Mr. Peterson," he addressed Bennett's client directly, "did your lawyer here promise you a big payday?" Sam Peterson, a middle-aged construction worker with his arm still in a sling, looked startled at being addressed. Before he could answer, Bennett intervened. "Objection, Your Honor. That question implies improper conduct on my part without any basis." "Objection overruled," Howard snapped. "And don't interrupt me again, Mr. Bennett. I'm beginning to question whether Harvard's standards have slipped significantly since I was in law school." Bennett noticed the court reporter's fingers flying across her keyboard, capturing every word of the exchange. He also saw the bailiff shifting uncomfortably and several spectators shaking their heads in disbelief. "Now," Judge Howard continued, "let's get through this quickly. I have more important cases waiting." For the next hour, the judge interrupted Bennett constantly, questioned his every statement, and made thinly veiled remarks about certain people trying to game the system. When Bennett tried to present his key witness, a safety inspector who had documented the violations, Judge Howard repeatedly cut off their testimony. "Your Honor," Bennett said finally, I must respectfully request that you allow our witness to complete their statement. It's crucial to establishing the pattern of negligence." Judge Howard's face reddened. "Mr. Bennett, are you telling me how to run my courtroom?" "No, Your Honor. I'm simply trying to present our case as is our right under the law." "The law?" Judge Howard let out a harsh laugh. "And I suppose you think you know more about the law than I do. Perhaps they gave you a special course at Harvard on how to talk back to judges?" The opposing counsel finally spoke up. "Your Honor, if I may, I think we should hear the witness's complete testimony. It could be relevant to our defense as well." Judge Howard glared at Wright, but grudgingly allowed the witness to continue. Throughout the testimony, he made a show of looking bored, checking his watch, and shuffling papers. When both sides had presented their cases, Judge Howard barely waited a moment before making his ruling. Motion for summary judgment denied. Case dismissed. Bennett stood quickly. "Your Honor, we haven't even had the chance to present our full argument." "Did I stutter, Mr. Bennett?" Judge Howard's voice was ice cold. "Case dismissed. And let me give you some free advice. Next time, come to my courtroom better prepared. This isn't some small claims court where you can wing it with half-baked evidence and emotional appeals." As the courtroom began to clear, Bennett carefully packed his documents. He could hear Judge Howard talking loudly to his clerk about the decline in professional standards, and letting anyone with a degree think they can practice law. Several attorneys approached Bennett as he left the courtroom, expressing their shock at the judge's behavior. One older lawyer, Patricia White, touched his arm gently. "I've never seen anything like that in 20 years of practice," she said quietly. "You handled yourself with incredible dignity, Mr. Bennett." Bennett gave her a small smile. "Thank you, but it's not about me. It's about my client who just lost his chance at justice because of—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Prejudicial treatment." As he walked toward the elevator, Bennett pulled out his phone and made a quick note of everything that had happened. He had been documenting similar incidents across the district for months now, building a file that would soon prove very important. But for now, he had to call his client and explain what had happened, then start working on their appeal. The security guard at the courthouse entrance nodded to Bennett as he left. "Rough day in Howard's court." "You could say that," Bennett replied. "Don't let him get to you," the guard said. "Some folks just can't handle seeing others succeed." Bennett stepped out into the afternoon sun, his mind already working on next steps. Judge Howard might think he'd won today, but he had no idea what was coming. Sometimes justice took a little longer to arrive, but arrive it would. As he walked to his car, Bennett's phone buzzed with an email confirming his upcoming appointment to the Judicial Review Board. He allowed himself a small smile as he got into his car. In just 4 weeks, he would be sitting on a very different kind of bench, and Judge Howard would learn that karma had a way of coming full circle. Charles Bennett sat in his office, carefully organizing the day's events into a detailed report. The late evening sun cast long shadows across his desk, where multiple folders lay spread out. Each contained similar incidents of judicial misconduct he had gathered over the past 6 months. His secretary, Mary Adams, knocked softly on his door. "Mr. Bennett, I have those transcripts you requested from today's hearing." "Thank you, Mary." He took the papers, noting how the court reporter had captured every condescending word from Judge Howard. "Did anyone else call about what happened in court today?" 3 attorneys left messages. They want to share similar experiences they've had with Judge Howard. Mary paused. "And Mr. Peterson called. He's worried about his case." Bennett nodded, feeling the weight of his client's situation. "I'll call Sam first thing tomorrow. He deserves better than what happened today." After Mary left, Bennett leaned back in his chair and looked at the framed photos on his wall. One showed him graduating from Harvard Law, standing proudly between his parents. His father, a postal worker, and his mother, a schoolteacher, had worked extra jobs to support his education. Another photo showed him receiving an award for his pro bono work with low-income families. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife, Karen. "Dinner's getting cold. Coming home soon?" "Just finishing up some important documentation," he replied. 20 minutes. Bennett turned to his computer and opened a secure folder labeled Judicial Review Board. Confidential. His recent appointment to the board wasn't public knowledge yet, and he intended to keep it that way until the right moment. As the newly appointed head of the Ethics Committee, he would soon have the power to address the systemic discrimination he had witnessed throughout his career. The next morning, Bennett arrived early at his law firm. He had barely settled in when Lisa Martinez, a fellow attorney, knocked on his door. "I heard about yesterday," she said, taking a seat. "Judge Howard did the same thing to me last month in a domestic violence case. He practically mocked my client's accent and suggested she was making up her story." Bennett pulled out a notepad. "Would you be willing to make a formal statement about that incident?" Lisa nodded firmly. "Many of us have stayed quiet too long, but after hearing what he did to you, a Harvard graduate with your reputation, it's clear he's not going to change unless someone takes action." As they discussed her experience, Bennett's phone rang. It was Judge Howard's clerk, Alice Brown. "Mr. Bennett," she spoke quietly, "I hope I'm not overstepping, but I've been documenting some things. Judge Howard's behavior, it's not just in the courtroom. The way he treats minority staff members." She trailed off. "Would you be willing to meet somewhere private to discuss this?" Bennett asked, keeping his voice neutral. "Yes, but please, I can't lose my job. I'm a single mother." "I understand completely. Everything you share will be handled with absolute confidentiality." After arranging to meet Alice later that week, Bennett turned his attention to preparing appeals for cases that have been unfairly dismissed by Judge Howard. He knew the appeals court would see the pattern of prejudicial rulings. During lunch, Bennett met with his old friend Daniel Carter, now a senior partner at another firm. Word spreading about yesterday, Daniel said as they sat in a quiet corner of their favorite deli. "But what most people don't know is that you're about to become Judge Howard's worst nightmare." Bennett smiled slightly. "The Judicial Review Board appointment isn't public yet." "No, but Howard's been making enemies for years. When this breaks, you'll have half the legal community ready to testify about his conduct. It's not about revenge, Daniel. It's about ensuring equal justice under the law isn't just a phrase we paint on courthouse walls." Later that afternoon, Bennett visited Sam Peterson at his home. The construction worker lived in a modest apartment with. "I'm sorry about yesterday, Sam," Bennett said, sitting at their kitchen table. "But I promise you, we're not giving up." "I know you did your best, Mr. Bennett," Sam replied, adjusting his arm in its sling. "The way the judge treated you, it wasn't right. We're filing an appeal, and this time, we'll get a fair hearing." Bennett purposely didn't mention his upcoming role that would help ensure exactly that. Back at his office, Bennett received an unexpected visit from Peter Wright, the opposing counsel from yesterday's case. "What Judge Howard did was wrong," Wright said, looking uncomfortable. "I've seen him do it before, but never that blatantly. I'd like to help if I can." Bennett studied him carefully. "Even if it means going against a judge you'll have to face in court again?" Wright nodded. "Some things are more important than winning cases." As the day wound down, Bennett received a confidential email confirming the date for his first Judicial Review Board meeting. In exactly 4 weeks, he would take his seat as the head of the Ethics Committee, the same committee that would soon be reviewing complaints about Judge Howard. That evening, as Bennett drove home, he thought about all the other lawyers who had faced similar discrimination but lacked the means to fight back. His appointment to the board wasn't just about one racist judge. It was about changing a system that too often turned a blind eye to prejudice. At home, Karen was waiting with dinner and their teenage daughter, Sophie. "Dad, we learned about civil rights in school today," Sophie said as they ate. "About people who fought to change unfair systems from the inside." Bennett shared a knowing look with Karen. Sometimes the best way to create change is to work within the system while documenting everything that needs to be fixed. "Is that what you're doing with all those files you keep bringing home?" Sophie asked. "Something like that," he smiled. "Sometimes justice takes time, but it's coming." Later that night, Bennett sat in his home office, carefully organizing the growing evidence against Judge Howard. He added today's statements to the file, noting patterns and cross-referencing incidents. The judge's behavior had grown worse over the years, as if he thought his position made him untouchable. His phone buzzed with a message from the Judicial Review Board secretary, confirming the schedule for next month's ethics hearings. Bennett noticed Judge Howard's name was already on the docket for multiple complaints. As he prepared for bed, Bennett thought about how Judge Howard had sneered at his Harvard degree. Soon, that same judge would learn that education, experience, and ethics mattered far more than prejudice and power. The wheels of justice might turn slowly, but they were already in motion. In 4 weeks, everything would change, but for now, Bennett would continue building his case, gathering evidence, and fighting for justice in a system that needed to change. He had learned long ago that the best way to fight discrimination wasn't with anger, but with methodical, documented truth. Tomorrow would bring more cases, more witnesses, and more evidence. But tonight, Bennett could rest knowing that soon, very soon, justice would prevail in ways Judge Howard never saw coming. The conference room on the 11th floor of the State Bar Association building buzzed with quiet tension. Charles Bennett sat at the head of a long table, surrounded by stacks of carefully organized files. 3 weeks had passed since his confrontation with Judge Howard, and the formal investigation was now in full swing. "Let's begin with the first complaint," Bennett said, addressing the group of investigators gathered around the table. "We have documented evidence of 15 cases where Judge Howard showed clear bias against minority attorneys and their clients." Susan Parker, a veteran investigator with gray hair and sharp eyes, opened her notebook. "The pattern is impossible to ignore. In the last year alone, Judge Howard dismissed 60% of cases brought by minority attorneys, compared to only 20% from other lawyers." Bennett nodded, pulling out another file. "And we've received statements from courthouse staff as well." Alice Brown, Judge Howard's clerk, had provided detailed notes of the judge's behavior behind closed doors. Her documentation showed a pattern of racist comments and unfair treatment that went beyond the courtroom. "He thinks he's untouchable," Alice had told Bennett during their private meeting at a small coffee shop last week. "The things he says when the courtroom is empty. I've been keeping notes for months, but I was too scared to come forward." The investigation team worked methodically through the morning, reviewing each piece of evidence. Lisa Martinez presented her testimony about how Judge Howard had mocked her client's accent and dismissed a domestic violence case without proper consideration. "He told my client she should learn to speak proper English before coming to his courtroom," Lisa explained, her hands gripping her coffee cup tightly. The woman had been badly beaten by her husband, but all the judge cared about was making fun of her pronunciation. By afternoon, more witnesses arrived to share their experiences. Peter Wright, the opposing counsel from Bennett's case, provided a written statement describing multiple instances of judicial misconduct he had witnessed. On March 15th, Bennett read from Wright's statement. Judge Howard referred to a Chinese-American attorney as one of those people and questioned whether her law degree was real. The investigation team documented each incident carefully. They collected court transcripts, witness statements, and statistical evidence showing a clear pattern of discrimination. Mary Adams, Bennett's secretary, entered the conference room with another stack of files. "3 more attorneys just submitted complaints," she said. "They say they were inspired to come forward after hearing about the investigation." Bennett reviewed the new complaints, noting how they matched the pattern they had already established. Judge Howard's behavior had grown more obvious over time, as if he believed his position made him immune to consequences. During a short break, Bennett stepped out to call his wife Karen. "How's it going?" she asked. "The evidence is overwhelming," he replied. "I never imagined so many people had similar experiences." "You're doing the right thing, Charles." Someone had to stand up to him. Back in the conference room, the team reviewed security camera footage from the courthouse hallways. In one clip, Judge Howard could be seen berating a young black intern for supposedly being in a restricted area, an area that was actually open to all courthouse employees. Patricia White, the senior attorney who had supported Bennett after his confrontation with Judge Howard, provided additional testimony about years of witness discrimination. "I've practiced law for 20 years, she stated. "I've seen Judge Howard systematically discriminate against minorities since he took the bench. He's just gotten more bold about it recently." As the day progressed, the investigation team organized the evidence into clear categories: discriminatory rulings, inappropriate comments, abuse of power, and witness testimonies. They'd also documented cases where Judge Howard had shown favorable treatment to certain attorneys while dismissing others based solely on their race or ethnicity. Sam Peterson, Bennett's client from the construction accident case, came forward with his own statement about how Judge Howard had treated him during the hearing. "He didn't even look at my medical records," Sam explained. "He just assumed I was trying to scam the system because of who I am and who my lawyer is." By late afternoon, the team had compiled an extensive report. The evidence showed not just isolated incidents, but a clear, long-term pattern of discriminatory behavior that violated judicial ethics codes and constitutional rights. "I practiced law for 20 years, she stated. "I've seen Judge Howard systematically discriminate against minorities since he took the bench. He's just gotten more bold about it recently." As the day progressed, the investigation team organized the evidence into clear categories: discriminatory rulings, inappropriate comments, abuse of power, and witness testimonies. They'd also documented cases where Judge Howard had shown favorable treatment to certain attorneys while dismissing others based solely on their race or ethnicity. Sam Peterson, Bennett's client from the construction accident case, came forward with his own statement about how Judge Howard had treated him during the hearing. "He didn't even look at my medical records," Sam explained. "He just assumed I was trying to scam the system because of who I am and who my lawyer is." By late afternoon, the team had compiled an extensive report. The evidence showed not just isolated incidents, but a clear, long-term pattern of discriminatory behavior that violated judicial ethics codes and constitutional rights. "We need to schedule the formal hearing," Susan Parker said, reviewing their findings. "This is more than enough evidence to warrant official action." Bennett checked his calendar, knowing that his appointment to the Judicial Review Board would be announced in just a few days. "Schedule it for next week," he said, "and make sure all witnesses are prepared to testify if needed." The team spent the final hours of the day organizing their documentation. They got statements from 15 attorneys who had faced discrimination, 10 courthouse employees who had witnessed inappropriate behavior, 23 clients whose cases were unfairly dismissed, 5 opposing counsels who had witnessed prejudicial treatment. As the investigation team packed up their materials, Bennett received a call from the State Bar Association president. "The announcement about your appointment goes out Monday," the president said. "Are you ready for what comes next?" "More than ready," Bennett replied. "The evidence speaks for itself." That evening, as Bennett drove home, he thought about how Judge Howard had mocked his Harvard degree and questioned his competence. Soon, that same judge would face the consequences of his actions before a board that Bennett would lead. At home, Sophie was working on a school project about justice systems. "Dad," she asked, "what happens when judges don't treat everyone fairly?" Bennett sat down beside her. "Then it's up to people who believe in justice to make things right. Sometimes that means gathering evidence, speaking up, and making sure everyone follows the same rules." Later that night, Bennett reviewed the final investigation report one more time. The evidence was clear and undeniable. Judge Howard's behavior had crossed every ethical line, and now he would have to answer for it. As he closed the file, Bennett thought about all the people who had been hurt by the judge's prejudice. The investigation wasn't about personal revenge. It was about ensuring that justice truly was blind, and that everyone received fair treatment in court, regardless of their race or background. In just a few days, the power dynamic would shift dramatically. Judge Howard would learn that his actions had consequences, and that true justice couldn't be stopped by prejudice or power. Bennett set his alarm for early morning. Tomorrow would bring more witness statements, more evidence to review, and more preparation for the upcoming hearing. But tonight, he could rest knowing that the investigation had revealed the truth, and change was finally coming to the courthouse. The morning of the judicial conduct hearing arrived with a crisp autumn chill. Judge Gregory Howard strode into the State Bar Association building, his usual air of superiority firmly in place. He nodded dismissively at the security guard and headed for the elevator, seemingly unconcerned about the hearing ahead. "6th floor, Your Honor." The receptionist called after him. "Room 601. Howard had faced these routine hearings before and always emerged unscathed. His 20 years on the bench had given him connections throughout the legal system, and he believed today would be no different. As he approached room 601, he noticed several familiar faces in the hallway, attorneys who had appeared in his courtroom, courthouse staff, and even some of his recent plaintiffs. The sight of Sam Peterson, still wearing his arm sling, made Howard pause briefly, but he quickly dismissed any concern. The boardroom door opened at exactly 9:00 a.m. Howard walked in confidently, straightening his red tie. Then he froze mid-step. Sitting at the center of the review board's table was Charles Bennett. Howard's face went pale. He blinked several times, as if trying to clear his vision, but Bennett remained in place, wearing his characteristic navy suit and calm expression. "Please be seated, Judge Howard," Bennett said formally, his voice carrying the authority of his new position. "This hearing of the Judicial Conduct Review Board is now in session." Howard's mouth opened and closed without sound. His eyes darted to the nameplate in front of Bennett. "Charles Bennett, Committee Chair, Judicial Ethics and Conduct Review Board." There must be some mistake," Howard finally managed to say. "No mistake, Your Honor," Bennett replied evenly. "Please take your seat. We have much to discuss." Howard sank into the chair facing the board, his usual confidence completely shattered. The other board members watched silently as Bennett opened a thick folder. "Judge Howard, this board has received multiple complaints about your conduct," Bennett began. "We have documented evidence of systematic discrimination, abuse of power, and violation of judicial ethics." Howard attempted to regain his composure. "Now see here, I've been a judge for 20 years. We can't possibly—" "I can and I will," Bennett interrupted firmly. "This isn't your courtroom, Judge Howard. Here, everyone receives equal treatment under the law." The door opened, and witnesses began filing in. Lisa Martinez entered first, followed by Peter Wright, Alice Brown, and a stream of others who had experienced or witnessed Howard's discrimination. "We have testimony from 28 individuals," Bennett continued, "including your own court staff. We have statistical evidence showing a clear pattern of biased rulings. We have security footage, court transcripts, and documented incidents spanning the past 5 years." Howard's face had progressed from pale to ashen. "You've been planning this," he accused. "That day in my courtroom." "That day in your courtroom," Bennett replied calmly, "was simply one example of your ongoing pattern of misconduct, a pattern that ends today." The board members began reviewing evidence. They played audio recordings of Howard making racist comments in his chambers, unaware that his clerk was documenting everything. They showed charts detailing the disproportionate dismissal rates for cases brought by minority attorneys. "Would you like to explain this statement from March 15th? Bennett asked, reading from a transcript. "You told a qualified attorney that her kind shouldn't be practicing law." Howard shifted uncomfortably. "That was taken out of context." "Then perhaps you'd like to explain the context of this security footage," Bennett continued, nodding to the screen where Howard could be seen berating a young black intern. "Or these dismissal rates, or the dozens of witnesses prepared to testify about your behavior." Each piece of evidence struck like a hammer, dismantling Howard's facade of authority. He watched as his years of discriminatory behavior were laid bare before the board. "This isn't fair," Howard protested weakly. "You're obviously biased against me." Bennett leaned forward slightly. "Biased, Your Honor? Like when you questioned my Harvard degree? Or when you dismissed Mr. Peterson's case without reviewing the evidence? Is that the kind of bias you're referring to?" The room fell silent. Howard's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. "The evidence speaks for itself," Bennett continued. "This board has documented over 50 instances of judicial misconduct. Your pattern of discrimination has harmed countless individuals seeking justice in your courtroom." Sam Peterson sat in the back of the room, watching as the judge who had dismissed his case now faced his own judgment. Alice Brown, the clerk who had risked her job to expose the truth, sat nearby, her notes spread before her. "Judge Howard," Bennett said, his voice level but firm, "this board has the authority to recommend your removal from the bench. We can also refer our findings to the State Bar Association for further action." Howard's arrogance had completely crumbled. The man who had mocked and belittled others from his position of power now sat silent, unable to defend his actions. "Before we proceed," Bennett continued, "would you like to make a statement regarding these allegations?" Howard looked around the room, seeing the faces of those he had wronged. The attorneys he had dismissed, the plaintiffs he had mocked, the staff members he had belittled. All were present to witness his downfall. I request time to consult with counsel," Howard managed to say. "Granted," Bennett replied. "This hearing will reconvene tomorrow at 9:00 a.m. I suggest you use this time wisely, Your Honor." As Howard stumbled out of the room, Bennett gathered his papers calmly. The other board members nodded in approval at how he had handled the situation. Lisa Martinez approached Bennett after the hearing. "That must have felt good," she said quietly. "This isn't about feeling good," Bennett replied. "It's about ensuring justice is truly blind. Every person who enters a courtroom deserves fair treatment, regardless of their race, background, or appearance." Outside the building, reporters had gathered, having heard about the hearing. Howard pushed past them without comment, his face hidden behind his hands. Bennett watched from the window as the judge who had once ridiculed him hurried to his car. The wheel of justice had turned, bringing truth to light and accountability to those who abused their power. Tomorrow would bring the final phase of the hearing, but today had revealed something important. No one was above the law, not even those who sat in judgment of others. The system could work, Bennett thought, when people had the courage to stand up and demand justice. As the sun set over the city, Bennett gathered his files, knowing that tomorrow would bring change not just for Judge Howard, but for the entire judicial system in their district. Sometimes, he reflected, justice arrived in unexpected ways, teaching valuable lessons to those who had forgotten its true meaning. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Judge Howard entered room 600, and one looking markedly different from the day before. Gone was his trademark arrogance, replaced by the demeanor of a man who had spent a sleepless night facing hard truths. Charles Bennett sat at the center of the review board's table, his expression neutral as Howard took his seat. The room was even more crowded than the previous day, with additional witnesses and several Bar Association representatives present. "Judge Howard," Bennett began, "have you prepared a statement for the board?" Howard stood slowly, his hands gripping a piece of paper. "Yes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have. Please proceed." "After reviewing the evidence presented yesterday, Howard paused, swallowing hard. "I must acknowledge that my conduct has been unacceptable. I have allowed personal prejudices to influence my judicial decisions, and in doing so, I have failed in my duty to uphold justice fairly." A murmur ran through the room. Few had expected such an admission from the previously unrepentant judge. "While this acknowledgement is noted," Bennett replied, "it doesn't erase the harm done to countless individuals in your courtroom. This board must now determine appropriate actions to address these violations." Susan Parker, another board member, opened a thick folder. "We have documented evidence of 57 cases where your rulings showed clear racial bias. 23 qualified attorneys faced discrimination in your courtroom. 35 plaintiffs were denied fair hearings based on their race or ethnicity." Howard's shoulders slumped. "I understand." Bennett leaned forward. Do you understand how Sam Peterson lost 6 months of wages because he dismissed his case without proper review? Or how Lisa Martinez's client remained in danger because you mocked her accent instead of hearing her domestic violence case?" "No," Howard admitted. "I didn't understand then, but I do now." Bennett turned to the other board members. "We have prepared our recommendations. Would any member like to speak before we proceed?" Judge Patricia Roberts, a senior member of the board, spoke up. "The evidence shows not just individual incidents of misconduct, but a systematic pattern of discrimination that undermines the very foundation of our justice system." The board members nodded in agreement. Bennett picked up a sealed envelope containing their decision. "Judge Gregory Howard," he began formally, "based on the evidence presented and your own admission of misconduct, this board has reached a unanimous decision." The room fell silent as Bennett continued. "You are hereby removed from your position as Superior Court Judge, effective immediately. Your cases will be reassigned to other judges, and all decisions from the past year will be reviewed for potential bias." Howard closed his eyes, accepting the inevitable. "Furthermore," Bennett continued, "this board recommends a full investigation of your prior rulings by the State Bar Association. You will also be required to complete extensive anti-bias training before being considered for any future legal position." As the consequences of his actions were laid out, Howard seemed to physically shrink in his chair. The man who had once wielded his power so carelessly now faced the results of his choices. "Would you like to make any final statement?" Bennett asked. Howard stood again, this time without papers. "I apologize to everyone I've wronged through my actions. I let power corrupt my judgment and prejudice cloud my decisions. I accept the board's decision." After Howard left the room, Bennett turned to the assembled witnesses and victims. Your courage in coming forward has helped ensure that justice prevails. Thank you. Sam Peterson approached Bennett afterward. What happens to my case now? It will be reheard by a different judge, Bennett assured him. This time, the evidence will be reviewed fairly. In the following weeks, changes rippled through the courthouse. Bennett implemented new anti-discrimination training programs for all judges and court staff. He established a system for reporting judicial misconduct that protected witnesses from retaliation. Lisa Martinez's domestic violence case was reheard, and her client received the protection order she desperately needed. Sam Peterson's case was reviewed, resulting in proper compensation for his injuries. 1 month after the hearing, Bennett sat in his office reviewing progress reports. The door opened, and Karen entered with their daughter Sophie. "Dad," Sophie said excitedly, "we learned about your case in civics class today." The teacher used it as an example of how the justice system can correct itself. Bennett smiled. The system works when people work together to make it better. Every person who spoke up, every piece of evidence collected, helped create change. Later that afternoon, Bennett received a letter from Alice Brown, Judge Howard's former clerk. She had been promoted to a senior administrative position and was helping implement the new anti-discrimination policies. Your actions gave others courage, she wrote. The courthouse feels different now. People aren't afraid to speak up anymore. As Bennett prepared to leave for the day, he passed the wall of judicial portraits in the courthouse hallway. Howard's picture had been removed, leaving a blank space that would soon be filled by someone new, someone who understood that true justice knew no color. The security guard nodded as Bennett walked out. "Things sure have changed around here, sir." "They have indeed," Bennett replied, "and they'll keep changing for the better." Driving home, Bennett thought about how a month ago he had stood in Howard's courtroom, facing discrimination. Now, he was helping reshape the entire judicial system in their district. It wasn't about revenge or personal vindication. It was about ensuring that every person who entered a courtroom received fair treatment under the law. That evening, as Bennett sat with his family at dinner, Sophie asked, "Dad, do you think Judge Howard learned his lesson?" Bennett considered the question carefully. Sometimes people need to lose their power before they understand how to use it properly. The important thing is that the system worked. Justice was served, not just for one person, but for everyone who deserves fair treatment in our courts. As the sun set over the city, Bennett looked out his window at the courthouse in the distance. The wheels of justice had turned slowly but surely, bringing change and hope for a better future. Sometimes, he thought, the best way to fight discrimination wasn't with anger or revenge, but with dignity, determination, and an unwavering commitment to justice for all. The story of the racist judge and the lawyer he underestimated would be remembered not as a tale of personal victory, but as a reminder that true justice requires vigilance, courage, and the willingness to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost.